I'm back with Hilary Bowen, who just read a sample from Out with Lanterns, her debut historical romance that is out now wherever you get books. And like I said, this was the first World War One historical romance that has come to the podcast. And frankly, I've read World War One historical fiction, but I don't know that I've ever encountered a historical romance in World War One before. So I'm curious if you can tell us what drew you to that period.
So I have this sort of aesthetic love of like the Edwardian period and that kind of movement into like the 20th century. And so I kind of had that in the background. I had just finished reading a book called The Children's Book by A.S. Byatt, which was incredible. And I mean, just is full of so much information and history. And so that was sort of swimming around in my brain. And then when I started thinking seriously about a story that I wanted to write, my original thought was the Land Army during the Second World War, because that's what I was familiar with. But when I was reading about the Land Army, I discovered that it actually was started in the First World War. And there were a few sort of different permutations before the one that we recognize really came together at the very end in 1917. And in the research and reading that I was doing there was a lot of contention around the idea of women doing war work that wasn't nursing, that wasn't a caring kind of job. And that wasn't pushback only from farmers or from men, but from women themselves. There was a real discomfort with the idea of upper class or even sort of middle class women doing what was considered labor in the fields. And so some of the other countries, in France, for instance, the women were working much earlier in the war in terms of like getting food and helping with all of those things. But it took quite a long time for people in England to come around to that idea. For my purposes in a romance, I didn't focus as much on sort of the day to day, what that looked like. And I know that maybe my version of it is probably a little bit rosy in terms of what women faced. There were all kinds of experiences, I think. So mine is sort of a very narrow slice of that I imagined. So that was kind of how that time period came around. I'm also really interested in the sort of dichotomies that are happening socially in the sort of late Edwardian, very early 1900s, like the rise of unions, the mobilization of people around better working conditions, the Labor Party, and just a lot of things. It feels like there's this kind of swell of new ideas and people wanting to challenge the status quo. And then at the same time, the reaction to that being really a real hard clamp down on that kind of activity. So I think those were things that I was interested in. And then it was a matter of figuring out how Silas could get to the farm, essentially. He came about when I was researching the use of the big estates in the UK as convalescent hospitals during the war. And there was a program in the later war where soldiers who were injured badly enough that they needed to come home for recovery and treatment, when they were recovered enough to be sort of mobile and useful, they were seconded sometimes to help with labor, farm work, or things on the home front because they weren't well enough to go back overseas. So that kind of worked for, bringing them into contact again in a realistic way.